Thanks, Ralph. It's good to be with you. I was also in the 60s, a veteran of Ralph's $500 per summer lucrative assistance program here. I think we did a study of the VA and then the Department of Agriculture. It was a great time, and it opened my eyes to this whole world of corporate crime and chicanery. And I guess that was a fatal sort of infection, because I've tried as hard as I could to become a member of the private elite in this country. I've tried to maintain an activist stance. I've been most recently in South Africa working with a group of trade unions about what they should be doing with respect to economic policy there, and basically trying to argue that corporate tax is a really powerful weapon if you learn how to make use of it. It can be used as a substitute for radical land confiscation. But one of the things they had to be aware of was that, just as the previous speakers have underlined, is there is, in fact, a global kind of race to the bottom going on. It's driven in the first instance now by the United States. Since the 1980s, we've had ratcheting down of corporate tax rates around the planet. Countries like South Africa and many countries in the developing world are much more dependent on corporate tax revenues than we are. We get about 8% of our federal revenues from the corporate tax. South Africa relies on it for 20%. And we've been seeing this, the impact of the United States basically now moving to becoming the leading tax haven in the world, not only on an individual level, but also on the corporate world, having a profound impact on the competitive sort of tax competition that developing countries are facing. I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about a particular favorite topic of mine, which is the global haven industry. It provides a context for a lot of the policies that we're discussing here. And it provides, I think, a good empirical response to the sort of market fundamentalism that's the subject of this conference. 60% of world trade today is conducted through captive subsidiaries. They're not subject to market forces. There are no arm's length standard comparables like the OECD says we have to insist on when we examine transfer pricing rules to see if they're competitive. And in fact, the short form statement of this is that the invisible hand is nowhere to be seen when it comes to international trade. My best example there is the banana industry. Everybody eats bananas, so I'm sure you be able to understand this. Let's take a banana that leaves Ecuador, owned by Chiquita Banana. The exports headed to Europe. Chiquita has managed to set up a chain of 15 intermediary companies between the Ecuadorian subsidiary that export bananas for around 15 cents a pound, pays about 1.5 cents of export tax on that. And the intermediary companies are set up in places like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Isle of Man, also Delaware, which is a leading onshore haven. And they cream off these charges that they apply to the transactions. So, the brand network is set up in the Cayman Islands, and that charges, 5 cents a pound. There's a purchasing network. There's a financing services provided by Bermuda. The trademarks are parked in the Isle of Man. By the time it gets to Europe, they've consumed about 90% of all the difference between the retail price of the banana and the wholesale price back in Ecuador without paying any taxes. Now, this system is almost impossible for Ecuador to audit, and it's very difficult even for the UK authorities to audit because of all these intermediate companies. I just recently came across a scheme that was architected by Morgan Stanley. in which they had set up 18 offshore companies in order to sell a phony tax credit generation scheme to the largest, the wealthiest investor in South Africa. So basically looting the South African treasury in exchange for a few $1 million that Morgan Stanley booked up front using this virtually unauditable offshore network. Well, that's just, you know, example of what we call the haven industry, which is run by the largest banks, law firms, and accountants on the planet, in addition to the multinational companies. And it specializes not just in tax dodging, but in kleptocracy, in laundering money, in facilitating odious finance, odious privatizations, unregulated finance. And it's not so much just low tax rates that it's offering, it's also, the central offer is financial secrecy and under-regulation. This kind of system provides a strong constraint on the ability of any developing country, let alone our country, to regulate this global tax competition effectively. In the case of the recent tax cut that was rammed through the Congress back in December 2017, you know, you may be familiar with the fact that by then U.S. companies had managed to accumulate about $2.6 trillion offshore, and Trump came in and saw this sitting there as an opportunity to distribute an enormous amount of money directly to the corporate sector. He implemented a 15% so-called repatriation tax on this $2.6 trillion. And then he also implemented a territorial tax going forward, so that not only would the U.S. corporate income tax be just 21% on the margin, but it only applies basically to U.S. domestic income. But the fine print is even worse. When you take a look at the 15%, corporations have 8 years to pay that tax, tax-free, interest-free. And furthermore, because of the territorial provision, if they simply leave the money offshore, you know, they're not taxable on any income generated by that offshore revenue going forward. And furthermore, they're not really required to repatriate it or to invest it here. So what they've been doing, a lot of them have been engaging in shareholder buybacks, but the tax has been deferred. So essentially, this is a kind of a big, underhanded $800 billion gift to U.S. companies. Where did that money come from originally? Well, the original sin was, you know, a lot of tax loopholes that were enacted, among others, by the Clinton administration in the 1990s, something called check the box. So you had Apple, for example, able to accumulate about $250 billion offshore, much of it by way of transferring intellectual property, patents and software, and trademarks to subsidiaries in Ireland and Bermuda and the Netherlands, and then paying themselves royalties tax-free. So this scheme made them effectively citizens of nowhere for tax purposes. Ireland didn't regard you as located in Ireland if you didn't have your management located there. The United States didn't regard you as a U.S. company if you were incorporated in Ireland. Again, this case of where the invisible hand here is nowhere to be seen. By now, we've accumulated on the individual side offshore an estimated $35 trillion invested by way of offshore entities in financial assets and in non-financial assets as well. Most of that being belonging to the top 100,000 people on the planet. In addition, we've had this enormous race to the bottom encouraged by the recent tax cuts. So at this point, we see, you know, developing countries like the ones I'm working with really having to get organized, and I think that's the way forward. If we're going to get out of the tax competition game, developing countries have to spend a lot more time organizing with each other, finding partners that are equally affected, and that's happening to some extent. Although it's pretty tough to overcome the years of polarization among these countries. I guess the last thing I would say is that on the way down here, I left Sag Harbor last night, and Sag Harbor is a wonderful community on the eastern end of Long Island. Encourage you to visit there. But you'd better do that quick, because BlackRock has just bought 30 properties, and they're blowing a hole through all of the wetland zoning and all of the zoning codes there. And they decided to turn Sag Harbor into a kind of a private yacht welcoming station. The other place I visited last night, though, was in Havre-le-Grace. My ancestors came to Havre-le-Grace, which is in Maryland, in 1781. And I was trying to imagine what it was like for them to arrive there. They were clearly finding a laissez-faire economy, no banks, no corporations, no public hospitals or roads or schools. I think it's impossible for us to imagine the United States having developed the way it has without having the benefit of having strong state and government management and having a tax system that could support that. And so I think one of the tasks we have to do is to explain to people the essential role that government has played, not only in our development up to this point, but in the future that we face. We face a future with climate change going on all around us, with issues like robotics staring us in the face, could have a dramatic impact on our labor force. With many of the problems that we're trying to solve in the world, problems that cannot be solved within the boundaries of any one country. They require collaboration and not competition. Thanks very much.